We have a plan for the next 90 minutes or so. We are going to begin with some initial remarks. Bill on the economy and the stimulus package. Suzanne on the Middle East broadly. Ben on warrantless surveillance and the FISA bill. And I will end, I couldn't resist with making some observations on the part of the speech that got more attention than it deserved, namely the discussion of earmarks. Now, first three broader observations, and then we will turn to Bill. I believe the beginning of the speech speaks volumes about the ideological differences that now exist between the parties that simply can't be settled by splitting the difference. The president began by saying, "Let us show them," that is, the people, "that Republicans and Democrats can compete for votes and cooperate for results at the same time," which was immediately followed by, "We must be guided by the philosophy that has made our nation great." And this is a philosophy that says we believe in the power of individuals to determine their destiny and shape the course of history. And so in all we do, we must trust in the ability of free peoples to make wise decisions and empower them to improve their lives for their futures. It is a public philosophy, ideology that certainly has guided the president and his administration, but it is not a consensual public philosophy in this country, and one disputed very substantially by most Democrats, and certainly by the guiding public philosophy of the Clinton administration that served for 8 years before the George W. Bush administration. What I take away from that is that beyond the stimulus package, little of great moment or import will be done in this second session of Congress, and the electorate's going to have to weigh in to adjudicate this dispute one way or another, to either continue to sort of divide the ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, or in some way to provide the means for one political party to go forward in a way that provides some more substantial attention to the very items that President Bush has failed to get the Congress to move on. That's number one. Number two, and I don't know if Bill will agree with this, I was struck by the relative absence of concern about the well-being of the economy. The language used was economic uncertainty. By my count, the discussion of the stimulus got less than a minute of time compared to the time discussing the importance of making permanent the tax cuts and acting on earmarks and balancing the budget. The third observation really goes to the fact that the biggest part of the speech, in my view, was the argument that the surge in Iraq is working. The enemy, which he defined clearly as Al-Qaeda, will be vanquished. We will leave only when the job is finished. On that score, Suzanne is going to have much to say, but my impression is that there's not much to be said outside of the political campaigns about Iraq over the last year of the president's time in office, that in fact the The president, for a variety of reasons, has gotten the flexibility to proceed as he believes we ought to proceed, and any decisions will be deferred to the next president. So with those initial observations, I turn to Bill Gale. Bill, what should we think of the president's general posture toward the economy, short term and longer term, and where does the debate on the stimulus package stand as we speak?
All right, thanks, Tom. In terms of the economy as a whole, we were just talking up here that it's my sense that we are, quote, succeeding in the economy the same way we are, quote, succeeding in Iraq. And when I read the quotes about how we're succeeding in the economy, I say that just isn't right. When I read the quotes about how we're succeeding in Iraq, I turn to my fellow colleagues and experts to get an opinion about that. But you're right, there was not a whole lot of chicken littling about the economy. Let me mention two quick issues that are in the way of throwaways and then focus on stimulus, which is a real issue. The earmarks issue that Tom mentioned is chutzpah, if nothing else. Earmarks are a very tiny fraction of the budget. They exploded under the Republican control of Congress earlier in the decade, and anything that the president said he would do to ignore the things in footnotes and special earmarks can be overwritten in a single line of legislation. So it doesn't strike me as a very serious initiative, and it's kind of odd that it's coming out now. Even less serious and more odd is the proposal to make the tax cuts permanent. Groundhog Day is at the end of this week, and if you remember the movie Groundhog Day, they kept replaying the same day over and over again. All right, well, we've been hearing this from him since 1999. This was a tax cut that was designed in December 1999 with the purpose of fending off Steve Forbes in the Republican campaign and with the purpose of establishing his kudos as a right-wing candidate. Right? Well, think about how the economy has changed since 1999. I won't go through all the details. What's interesting is that every year, the answer to whatever the issue is the same, which is make the tax cuts permanent. One of my colleagues suggests that he had to do that this year because of the writer's strike. He couldn't get any new stuff into the text. but I think it's more than that. What's interesting is he has never once proposed a way to pay for making the tax cuts permanent. You either need to raise other taxes or you need to cut spending. There are going to be some feedback effects, yes, but they can go both ways, especially if there are big budget deficits. Never once has the issue even been addressed that there's a need to pay for the tax cuts, much less how you would do it. Just to give you a sense of what a big issue that is, let's suppose you wanted to cut spending to pay for the tax cuts, to make them long-term. But you didn't want to cut Social Security because you were going to have to cut that anyway to fix Social Security. You didn't want to cut Medicare or Medicaid because you're going to have to cut them anyway to rein in entitlements. You can't cut net interest because that's called defaulting, and you don't want to cut defense and homeland security because although the surge is working, if we pull back in Iraq, it'll stop working. Okay, so if you can't cut those things, you would have to cut the rest of the government by half to pay for the tax cuts. All right, 50%. So that's a sign of the magnitude of the change in taxes that he's proposing every year, never considering how to pay for it. And so I think at this point let's just take that off the table. If you want to ask questions about it, fine, but there's just not a whole lot more to say after 8 years. So let me turn to the stimulus. Let me say three things about that. One is we are going to get a stimulus package. Two, the cure is not really going to match the underlying sickness. And three, there are some risks involved here that need to be highlighted. So let me start that. We will get a stimulus package, because, well, the main reason is it's an election year, and politicians really want to be seen as doing something. And you should not underestimate the power of incumbents coming together under the name of bipartisanship to protect their own seats. I think that's a first-order issue in the motivation for this. The other motivation, which I'll come back to, is last year we talked about PAYGO rules. Well, PAYGO rules are out the window if you're talking about stimulus. So all of a sudden, all the various pent-up ideas that people have wanted to move but couldn't because it cost money, now they can get stuck into the stimulus package or the stimulus debate. I'll come back to that in a second. What the package will look like is something like what the House and the White House have come up with. The Senate is a little annoyed that they weren't involved. They'll change some things. There might be a food stamp or an unemployment insurance thing. They might cut back on the business aspect. But basically, the centerpiece is going to be a big rebate. There's an issue about who gets it, seniors, low income, or just income taxpayers or just payroll taxpayers. But basically, there's going to be a big rebate. There's going to be some stuff around it. It's going to be about 1% of GDP. So there is going to be a bill. That's point one. Point two, the bill is not going to really address the underlying issue. All right? What's the underlying issue? Well, it's sustained and systematic expediency in the economic system. And you see this in households, bringing the household saving rate down to zero, the first time since the 1930s that happened. You see this in lenders basically ignoring all standards of lending and just giving almost anybody whatever loan they want. You see this in the federal government, which has raised spending and cut taxes like it's gone out of style the last 6 or 7 years. And you see this in the Fed, which cut interest rates to historic lows in the mid part of the decade. So everybody is pushing toward now. Finally, the housing market bursts, and everyone thought it was in a bubble. And so housing is coming down. People are spending less, which means they're saving more. And the policy response to all this is, well, let's get housing back up and let's get saving back down. So it's sort of like you get drunk, you have a hangover, you go get another drink to solve the hangover. And so we're trying to get out of this by borrowing more. The government's going to borrow more, people are going to spend more, people are going to save less. You can't get there from here in a long-term sense. You can boost the economy up, but it's a little bit like the Iraq situation. We're succeeding in Iraq, but if we pull people out, we won't be succeeding. Well, the economy is succeeding by some measures because it's being stimulated so continually and so substantially. If we pull that stimulus back, then it's not going to succeed as much. And that's sort of my concern, is that the cure is not going to match the disease. There's a good case for instilling confidence in the normal operation of financial markets. There's a good case for helping people in need, which is food stamps, unemployment insurance, low income. The big rebate that's going to middle-class households, I don't think is justified as well. No one yet has laid out how getting people money so they can buy bicycles at Toys R Us is going to unlock the restraint that's occurring in financial markets. The real issue is financial markets and the lack of liquidity there, and I don't see much happening on that score. All right, let me close just with some of the risks, because some people say, all right, maybe it's not such a great idea, but why don't we just do it anyway? What's the harm? Well, what's the harm is that if we systematically over-sustain the economy, we're going to be right back in the situation that we started in. A lot of people think the current issues are the results of too much stimulation earlier in the decade. The other harm is, as I said, PAYGO is gone. There's no way in the rest of the year that members of Congress who didn't get what they want in the stimulus package are then going to agree to PAYGO later in the year. They're going to say, no, you got your goodies in January. We were willing to postpone our goodies because we needed a simple, fast bill, but now we want our goodies, and we're sure as heck not going to subject our goodies to PAYGO if your goodies weren't subjected to PAYGO. So budget discipline is sort of out the door as well. Lastly, as an economist, there's this notion that tax policy can solve anything, and that whenever there's an issue, the right answer is the federal government to jump in and jigger someone's tax schedule. And that every time we reaffirm that notion with a debate like this, I think we do lasting damage to the conduct of real reform. So,
Bill, if you were in a position to decide what if any sort of fiscal response to the impending recession should be, what would it look like?
I thought I was in a position to decide. I would focus on getting financial markets to function normally again, restoring confidence, in particular liquidity, to financial markets. I would focus on helping out households that are particularly hurt by the situation. As I mentioned, food stamps, unemployment insurance, low-income rebates. I would focus on trying to work out some mortgage solutions in situations where it would make a difference. I can talk more about that if you want. But I think those are the main elements.
Okay. To the Middle East, Suzanne. I believe I heard a week or so ago one of your colleagues say that in the first 6 State of the Union speeches, or is it 5? I think 6. The president did not mention the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Now he has not only mentioned it, but promised to produce a solution by the end of this term. Is that Panglossian, and does that reflect a sort of a broader and unjustified optimism about the broader Middle East?
Well, let me just say a few things generally about the president's discussion of foreign policy issues in the Middle East last night, because I think, as you noted at the outset of this discussion, it was quite interesting that foreign policy comprised a fairly significant chunk of the speech last night,
right,
which, in a sense, it seemed to be a bit of a disconnect with certainly the domestic political dynamics here in the States, where there's been so much discussion, at least over the past few weeks, of the economy and internal issues. It also seems to be something of a disconnect from the international environment, which is obviously quite challenging for American interests right now. But the president did spend quite a bit of time talking about the region, talking in particular about Iraq. I'd suggest he spent considerably little time focused on the peace process, despite some of the indications in advance of the speech that he might highlight that issue during the speech itself. While he spoke a lot about the region and about foreign policy, in this speech, I think, in contrast to some of his previous speeches, either State of the Unions or some of the notable speeches that he gave on the region and in the region, I'd note that his rhetoric was relatively sober. There was still a lot of talk about the big ideas, the freedom agenda, democracy, liberty, tyranny, but ultimately it was a much more sober discussion, a much more, one would argue, realistic discussion of some of the challenges that America faces in a variety of arenas. Let me just hit a couple of highlights on Iraq, Iran, the freedom agenda, and the peace process, and I'd be happy to get back to any greater depth on any of those parts during the discussion. On Iraq, obviously the president was taking the opportunity to take some credit for the change in the dynamics on the ground over the past year, and understandably so, since I think no one can argue at this stage that despite most of the predictions from the punditocracy, or at least the punditocracy in certain elements of Washington, the surge has contributed to an arrest in what was a dangerously escalating cycle of violence in Iraq. And so the president last night focused the bulk of his foreign policy discussion on Iraq and on what he would argue as success in Iraq, in order to both, I think, take credit for that success, but also try to make the case forcefully for the continuation of his approach. As you suggested in your opening remarks, I think that very much is left to the internal political debate and to the next president. And it does not appear likely that there is a lot of support, at least on a popular level, for the perpetuation of the current approach. But obviously the president is trying to take credit for that. There, I think I would have some problems with attributing the surge to the real shift that we've seen in Iraq. There has been a shift, but I think we can recognize that the shift is as much a product of a change in decision-making calculus by some of the key actors, particularly Sunni militias and Shia militias, which for various reasons, including, I would argue, the debate here in this country about the need for an eventual American withdrawal from Iraq, have in part begun to start cooperating with the U.S. on the part of Sunni militias and on the part of Shia militias engage in something of a ceasefire in order to both combat Iraq and preserve their place in power. So you've seen some stabilization in Iraq, but I'd argue we've also seen a real disconnect between the dynamics on the security sphere and the dynamics in the internal politics, which is to say that we're not seeing any real carryover in terms of political progress. Most of the really hard issues for Iraq remain unresolved at this time. And there's very little likelihood, I would argue, over the next year that we're going to see any vast improvement in some of the political dynamics, the decision-making, the really tough issues that the Iraqi government is going to have to come to terms with. The president situated Iraq, as he has consistently, in this broader rubric of the freedom agenda. And I think there you also have a kind of dangerous misconception that the problem in the Middle East is one of terror versus democracy, and that ultimately the only obstacle or the primary obstacle to the advance of a more representative order and a more hopefully peaceful and prosperous order in the region is the presence and persistence of terror. I think if you look across the region, one can certainly cite terror as a significant difficulty, but one has to also look at some of the main Arab states in particular and understand that it's the persistence of autocracy rather than the persistence of terror that is really the obstacle to freedom and to the president's freedom agenda. So I think there I would have to suggest that the president is continuing to engage in what I would say is somewhat hyperbolic rhetoric that poses very little prospect for making a difference in the region. On Iran, there was some clear pushback and some clear effort to demonstrate that the administration has not changed tacks, despite the assessment that came out from the intelligence community several months ago on the status of the Iranian weapons design program for its nuclear program. The president, in a way echoing another former president in the waning days of an administration, echoed the Carter Doctrine in his promise that the U.S. would confront any threat to American interests in the Persian Gulf. And I think that was language that was very carefully vetted and considered over quite a long time. It was an endeavor to demonstrate to our allies in the region that we're going to continue to be there. The difficulty, of course, is that our allies have already begun, I think, casting their bets in other directions. And what we've seen, certainly, despite the president's trip out to the region last month or earlier this month, it's very clear that the key Arab states, Egypt and Saudi Arabia in particular, are looking to co-opt and appease Iran, to deal with Iran, negotiate as much as they are to confront. They want to contain without confrontation. And ultimately, I think that that's the way that Iran is going to play out for the termination of this administration. The president also made some of his typical appeals to the Iranian people, fulsome praise for the glorious nation of Iran, which he has done on a somewhat consistent basis since the early part of his first administration, to very little impact on the ground in Iran. It's important to remember, of course, that Iran, despite a very difficult political environment and a very problematic government, Iran is on the verge of its 28th national election in 29 years, which is a record that contrasts somewhat favorably to many of its neighbors in the region. These are not free and fair elections, obviously, but they are elections that enable the population to have some say in the shape of their government, and that is not something that many of Iran's neighbors experience on a regular basis. Finally, the peace process. It was almost an afterthought in the speech, right. It seemed to me. The president cited new cause for hope, which I think is undercut by what we see and certainly what Middle Eastern audiences are viewing every day on their television sets as developments on the ground. It's very difficult to see what that new cause for hope would be. I think the administration has relied on a somewhat problematic and poorly drawn out set of assumptions as a formula for peace, which is that the threat of Iran would change the nature of the region, change the nature of decision making in the region. And I think for better or for worse, what we've seen is that very much isn't the case, and we're likely to see very little, I would suggest, in terms of progress on the peace process. Thanks.
Thank you, Suzanne. Ben, I waited in the speech for the president to get to homeland security, to warrantless surveillance, to issues surrounding the FISA court, and I said, oh my God, he may not mention it, but there it was at the end. And of course, the comments came on the same day. The the legislation to extend the authority provided in a sort of temporary fix was on the floor of the Senate and unresolved with the failure of two cloture votes. The president threatened to veto any short-term extension of the bill, 30 days, and talked about the horrible damage that would be done if that authority lapsed. What are we to make of the president's comments, of the nature of the dispute between antagonists on this issue, and how serious a problem is it?
All right. Well, let me try to take those questions sort of in order. I'd like to make three broad points. One about the text of the president's speech itself, and specifically his claim that there is a sort of an impending crisis at the end of the week if the legislation that he wants is not passed. The second about the sort of scope of the policy dispute itself that exists between the president and the Republicans on the one hand and congressional Democrats on the other hand. And the third is about and somewhat in tension with the second, is actually about the sort of tone and partisanship of that this issue has acquired, which is actually something rather new. So let's start with the text of the president's speech, in which he said, speaking of this temporary fix that Congress passed in August, unfortunately, Congress set the legislation to expire on February 1st. That means if you don't act by Friday, our ability to track terrorist threats would be weakened and our citizens will be in greater danger. I say this as somebody who is not at all unsympathetic to the policy objective that the administration is pursuing here. That is, I think, perilously close to simply untrue. And it's part of a bewildering, to my mind, effort on the part of the administration and Republicans to kind of create a crisis and force their preferred action using a crisis. Let's be very clear about what expires on Friday. The Protect America Act, which is this temporary fix, gives the Director of National Intelligence and the Attorney General the authority to enter orders for warrantless surveillance of targets reasonably believed to be overseas. That is, to identify categories of surveillance targets, as long as they're overseas or we reasonably think they are, that are kind of outside of FISA, which normally requires going to the FISA court and getting a warrant. What expires on Friday, those orders are good for a year. And so what expires on Friday is the authority to issue new orders, which means that if on Thursday orders are entered, at least as I read the statute, and I think the statute is quite clear, actually, if on Thursday they enter a series of orders, those orders should cover them for the duration of the Bush administration. And when at the time that the Protect America Act was passed, I read this provision and sort of chuckled to myself and said, they've called this a 6-month fix, but this actually solves the problem for them. I think the sense in which there is a crisis is actually extremely limited, which is that if some new situation arose that for some reason wasn't covered by any of the orders that they had entered, that situation would be governed by pre-Protect America Act FISA, which would in fact be potentially onerous. So I think the first point is that this idea that on Friday we're going to revert back to, which, by the way, the New York Times editorial page the other day had an editorial saying, great, let's revert back to FISA. I mean, everybody's arguing on this basis, and it's not really true. So that's the first thing is a procedural point, that we actually have a lot more time to get this right, with or without the 30-day patch that Senator Reid wants, than I think the public debate about it and the sort of public posture of the administration is letting on. On the substance of the issue, and this actually I think cuts in somewhat the opposite direction, there has been, rhetoric notwithstanding, an amazing harmonic convergence of the two sides on all issues except one on this. If you think about when this issue broke, which was at the time the New York Times broke the story of the NSA's warrantless surveillance program, you had an administration that was saying, we can operate outside of FISA, period, full stop. Almost taking a position that FISA is advisory. And you had, on the other hand, a fairly wide chorus of people arguing that the FISA is not merely binding, but B, completely adequate, and that there's under no circumstances should anybody be operating outside of it. Now, both sides have really, all the while maintaining that they've been right the whole time, both sides have moved very considerably. The administration in January of last year announced that they had brought the entire warrantless surveillance program under FISA, which is to say that they had figured out a way, and since we know so little about actually in very granular terms what precisely it is, it's a little bit hard to fathom how they could have done this. But they had gotten the FISA court itself to approve the orders under which they were operating. And now they are arguing for a statute to authorize what they are doing. In other words, while they preserve this idea that they have, the president has the inherent authority to conduct this kind of surveillance, they're very actively operating now in a statutory framework. It's very important to them that FISA permits what they want to do, not merely that they can sort of run roughshod over it. On the other hand, if you look at what the Democrats have done, and the Democrats started with this sort of outraged contention that everything needs to have a warrant, we need to be operating in a statutory framework. Put aside the rhetoric of the current debate, and no one's really still arguing that. Everybody has basically consensed around a broad outline of what this statute should look like, which is to say that for people in the United States, and actually for U.S. citizens abroad, the government should go get a FISA warrant under normal old, 1978 FISA. But for non-U.S. persons overseas, this stuff should be conducted, as it always has been, by the way, without warrants, and that the role of the FISA court, and can be done on a programmatic basis, that is, and the role of the FISA court should be limited to the approval of procedures, the procedures by which the NSA determines whether somebody is outside the country and therefore not subject to FISA, or inside the country subject to FISA. So there's really a broad agreement at this point that the answer to this question is going to involve a lot of warrantless surveillance. And I think that's a very substantial part of this debate that is misunderstood, is how much agreement there is at this point. There is one big exception to that, and that's actually, notwithstanding the rhetoric about warrantless surveillance, what's hanging up an agreement, I don't believe has really much to do with the programmatic nature of the surveillance. It has everything to do with the question of whether the telecommunications companies will get retroactive immunity and civil liability for having cooperated with the original warrantless surveillance program. Now, this is actually sort of a really interesting issue that has nothing to do with the prospective architecture of what surveillance is going to look like. So it's an interesting issue to hang up an agreement of what should happen, going forward in this area.
Democrats first had to finish up really pass the fiscal 07 budget, appropriations bills, 8 spending bills. They set as their target the reduction in the cost of appropriations earmarks at 50%. It's very difficult getting hard measures of these, but ironically, the Appropriations Committee reports a 43% reduction. One of the conservative citizen watchdog groups, Citizens Against Government Waste, puts it at 51%. Others have come in slightly lower, but the bottom line in terms of dollar amounts, for the first time there has been a substantial reduction in cost, and at the same time there have been substantial increase in the level of transparency in applying to earmarks, and yet this is the time now we get the president, the Republican Party in particular, of focusing on earmarks. Now maybe that isn't surprising. You begin to make progress, and then you say this is an outrage, rather than when the outrage is developing. I mean, the fact is there are abuses. There certainly are, in many cases, much more effective ways of channeling resources. Transparency is the route to go. Don Edwards is in hot water now because of his effort to intervene in Florida transportation policy, and that's costing him something. There are financial conflicts of interest. There are other sorts of abuses, and I think Congress is on the path to beginning to do something about it. And final point, as Bill said, Congress has the power of the purse, and to issue an executive order to tell the agencies not to pay any attention to committee language report can be overcome instantaneously and will be. Okay, the agenda is yours. Questions, please. We'll bring a mic to you. Please.
Tom, if we can just stay with you for a moment, can I ask you to also comment on Kathleen Sebelius's counter State of the Union speech by the Democratic response very shortly thereafter?
It was a very interesting response. It showed the advantage of picking someone who was not a member of Congress, not caught up in the immediate battles there, to take a tone of a high road, of getting beyond the partisan battles. If anything, fit well with Barack Obama's campaign themes. I can't. Would it fit better? I can't imagine. I can't imagine it. And yet, if you listen to the speech at the same time, she really had quite a harsh critique of the foreign policy of the Bush administration, and as well as the allocation of resources on the domestic side. So I thought it was, in purely political terms, it was an effective framing of a response to talk about an American response rather than a Democratic response, but at the same time, the specific comments that she made underscore the reality that there is a Democratic critique of Republican governing ideas, and that is inevitable. It will emerge during the course of the general election campaign. In the back there, please.
Hi, my name is Kelsey Statiker. I'm with the International Fund for Agricultural Development. And in terms of allocation of funds and our foreign policy, what do you think the budget is going to look like in terms of the president's commitment to international development? Is the outlook favorable that a significant amount of the 2009 budget will be allocated to international aid? Maybe Ms. Mann could comment on that.
Okay. Bill, Suzanne, would either of you like to weigh in on this?
No. I have no idea what the answer to that question is.
No, I think, again, the president did not do a sort of wide-ranging foreign policy agenda in this speech. He was very narrowly focused, very much focused on Iraq. You almost had, very little mention, I think no mention whatsoever of Russia, almost offhand reference to India and China in the context of the debate or the discussion on what to do about climate change. So in a sense, this was a very targeted State of the Union. It was very much intended to focus attention specifically on what the administration would argue is, the returns on American investment in Iraq.
I'd pick up on a couple of things. One, the continuing commitment of the president to AIDS funding. This has been a signature feature of his administration, and he's indicating he intends to pursue that. There really is a lot of support for the overall allocation, but disputes over how those resources are spent. The other thing he mentioned at some length was the Millennium Challenge, the effort to allocate foreign assistance in different ways, in ways that invest in countries that are making their own investments in responsive government and effective bureaucracy and the rest. Because of the squeeze on dollars, the Congress hasn't been particularly generous with that, and I don't see any turnaround on that. What you have now are priorities running up against one another, and with the high cost of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the additional costs now of building up the military, getting more combat brigades, with the slowdown in the economy, therefore the increasing budget deficit, it seems to me it's going to be very difficult for the president to salvage any new funding out of the current budget battle. Yes.
Thank you. Tatiana Koprovich, Voice of America. It's sort of a follow-up to the previous question. Also, President briefly mentioned Georgia and Ukraine as positive examples of freedom agenda development. What can you say about this topic? Take into account the difficulties that both countries face right now with democracy development, politics, and so on. Do you think the current administration should or could take credit, and is it really positive examples? Thank you.
We know who that's to.
Well, of course, this is a little bit beyond my competence because I'm very much a Middle East person. But let me just say again, I thought the discussion on the freedom agenda was very interesting, and we have a scholar here actually at the Saban Center who will have a book coming out very shortly looking at this whole issue and how the Bush administration has implemented this democracy promotion strategy, looking specifically at the Middle East. But I think it's important to note that the president, despite the reiteration of some of these expansive concepts like liberty and democracy, and very much non-specific concepts, that he also followed that up very quickly with a reiteration of what he saw as the challenges and the likelihood that this was not going to be an easy or quick process. And that, in a sense, I think it was a much more sober reflection of what the challenges are, but also, I think, a more realistic assertion of what American interests are and the American role to play in promoting democracy. So, in this area, as in a lot of what he had to say, there was not a lot of new, there was not a lot of specific, there were references to a few of these countries and some of the progress that we've seen, but also I thought very clearly reference to the fact that we've seen a rollback in some areas, or in areas where we have seen some positive developments, that we've seen that can very quickly become mired in internal squabbling, and I think that's a challenge that the next administration will have to face, because I think in a sense 9/11 has made permanent the discussion of democracy in American foreign policy. Obviously, as the president suggested last night, and as many others have written, this is in many ways a concept and a notion that is intrinsic to the American ideal, and that has been a recurring theme in American foreign policy throughout different administrations over several centuries. But in fact, 9/11 has made it impossible, I think, for any future president to simply disregard the concept of what the internal character of regimes that we have relationships with will be. And so it's the challenge for the next administration to, I think, bring it down a level of granularity, to talk less about these very big concepts of liberty and tyranny, but and talk more specifically about what role America can play in actually bringing out progress. Liberty, freedom are not zero-sum concepts, and I think that that's the challenge for a new administration.
Yes. Please.
A number of commentaries have said that the State of the Union speech was overshadowed by Kennedy's endorsement of Barack Obama. Is that very common? Has that happened very often in the past?
Listen, it's inevitable. When you have a two-term administration, as the political cycle for the selection of his successor is well underway, that attention will focus on the contest more and less on the president's parting words. It's especially pronounced this time because the race is so open on both sides. There is no incumbent vice president seeking the nomination, as was the case with Reagan and Clinton, and therefore they knew that what they said was going to have a bearing on the campaigns of their vice president to succeed them. This time there's no such restraint, but what that means is it separates the president's comments from the immediate interest in the country, which is, hey, who's next? This guy's about through. So I think you're right. The attention given to that event, the anticipation of the Florida primary today, both overshadowed the President's State of the Union speech, and the President was well aware of that. He's well aware of facing a Democratic Congress. There were no pretensions about expecting great success in working with this Congress. The one choice he had is a choice that Ronald Reagan had, who was popular at the time. He had recovered from Iran-Contra with the economy beginning to be very healthy. He actually did business with the Democratic Congress. He saw areas where if he compromised, if he went with some of their initiatives, he could reap some legislative harvest, and he did it. Bill Clinton did that during the fourth year of his first term in anticipation of having a record of achievement for running for re-election. But this president, having low public approval ratings, figured he'd get little in such negotiations, and for the most part, his concern now is showing resolve, of sticking to his principles, and he has this extraordinary reassurance that in the long run, historians and publics will see that he made principled decisions on the domestic and international front. They led to some instability, disruptions, problems in the short term, but over the long term will prove themselves. And that reassurance leads him to sort of stick to his guns on the major pillars of his agenda, basically defending it and not looking for any withdrawal or compromises with it. And that you combine that with the nature of the presidential contest, and you understand why this is more a non-event than an event.
Tom, I have to jump in here. I think that's way too Panglossian, if that's the word you used, or an answer. The fact is, the country faces all sorts of issues. We've got infrastructure problems. We've got energy, environmental issues. We've got immigration issues, which the president has talked about. We've got long-term entitlement issues. Your last State of the Union, your last year in office, is a chance to actually say, look, let's get this done. Let's throw politics to the side. I'm not running for re-election. My VP is not running for election. Let's actually do something. He chose to do none of that. Now, you call that standing on principle, I call that an enormous waste of an opportunity that replicates a waste that we've had the last 7 years. All these issues have gotten worse since 2001, and they've just been ignored time and again by this administration. Even something as simple as improving the retirement security system, where there actually is bipartisan interest in things like making saving more automatic, easier, more rewarding. They don't even talk about that. There's no impetus for moving forward here. And I think the reason the speech was a dud was something Tom said earlier. The stimulus package was the only thing that even resembled a new idea, and even that has issues with it. So I think this is an enormous wasted opportunity by the administration, and I think Tom is right that it bespeaks an effort to look toward history as opposed to actually solving the issues that the country faces.
Yeah, just to be clear, I'm not defending what the president is doing. I'm trying to explain it. I'm trying to understand what's in his mind, what he thinks is important. And the problem, Bill, with what you say, the president should just dispense with politics and proceed to get the job done. It assumes there is a nonpartisan or bipartisan solution to health care, to long-term fiscal imbalance, to a whole set of other problems. My belief is that there are such profoundly opposed views of how to deal with these problems that you can't split the difference, that it awaits the public weighing in and providing a basis on which to try to reframe those issues in ways that would allow broader coalitions to support initiatives that actually deal with the problems. I think
that's exactly my point.
Yeah.
He should be laying the groundwork now. If nothing is going to happen legislatively, where is the administration's study task force to lay out options to deal with global warming and environmental degradation? Where is their task force to deal with the problems of the inner city? Where is their task force, their white paper, their proposal to deal with any of the other issues? I think you're doing what most of the media does, which is practice the soft bigotry of low expectations and apply it to the Bush administration. All right? I mean, let's be clear. There are enormous issues out here that are just being completely ignored. I mean, how can you look at the country and all the issues that we face and give a State of the Union address to Congress and the American people and the world and not say anything new? That's just an abdication of power.
Thank you. But it doesn't sound terribly surprising. It would seem to me that a right-wing president, who really became a right-wing president after 9/11, it seems to me, particularly, has a very strong invested interest in keeping a movement alive, and the movement basically is trench warfare. In that circumstance, I see no incentive for him at all to be bipartisan. Zero, in fact. Now, I'm just asking a question. Is there anything I guess what I'm asking is, Bill, to some degree, I sense your concern, if not almost outrage. Are you shocked that this man, at this point in history, would be behaving the way he is?
There's an Elvis Costello line, one of my great social philosopher kings, that I used to be disgusted, now I try to be amused. Right? It doesn't shock me that he's not addressing these issues, but I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that the President of the United States has the power and the elected authority to deal with these issues. And I'm not saying he should be partisan or nonpartisan. He can choose to elect them to address these issues. He can choose to lay out the claims for global warming and environmental issues in a partisan way or a nonpartisan way. Either way, it would provide something that might look like a legacy. I mean, right now his legacy is tax cuts that are going to expire in 2010 and the situation in Iraq. And if I were him, I think well, that's another question, but if I were his advisors, I would advise him to try to get more of a legacy. And standing up in front of the world and saying nothing, I just don't see what the point of that is.
Ben.
I actually think to brand myself publicly as naive, I actually think it is surprising. And I think the explanation of it probably has a lot to do with immigration, which is that if at the beginning of the Democratic Congress, the administration clearly looked around and said, what's the issue where there is a sort of, where we and a Democratic Congress could most plausibly, on the domestic front, really have a breakthrough of some kind. And I think a lot of people thought it was immigration. The administration clearly thought it was immigration, and they got clobbered. And so I think part of the explanation for it is that they, as your question points out, they have a very ambivalent relationship with the idea of bipartisanship to begin with, and when they've tried it, they're not very good at it, and it hasn't worked very well for them. And so but that said, I think it is surprising that on your last State of the Union address, you articulate a long laundry list of relatively low bore, sort of small bore programs that none of which you would want, say, written on your gravestone, and I think that is a particularly for somebody who has been willing to think as ambitiously as George W. Bush. I mean, and you can agree or disagree with things like the invasion of Iraq, these gigantic tax cuts, No Child Left Behind, but they were very ambitious, policy proposals. And I think for him to sort of, go out with a whimper like that I was surprised by it.
Well, I think that you mentioning immigration is a good point. Remember, the two major domestic policy initiatives of President Bush in his second term were Social Security reform and immigration. Immigration at least got to a vote or some votes. Social Security was never introduced. His own party ran away from him on that issue. These were tackling some of the mega issues that Bill is talking about. I'd add to that health reform because, in fact, the president had a pretty ambitious sort of tax proposal and has made clear his approach is to stimulate markets to empower individuals and to use the tax code to increase the likelihood of disciplining the cost and extending the coverage and improving the quality of insurance. You can disagree with it, but he's laid out markers. He's done it, and he got clobbered on Social Security and immigration, and his health reform agenda went nowhere. Now, what is he to do? Well, I didn't really mean that on Social Security and health. I really have something else in mind that's closer to the Democrats, and here's what I propose. Or alternatively, taking another cut at immigration, but sort of backing off what he said. I think the president realized that in his own way he tried with those and failed utterly. He'd rather than sort of change in this last year, because the odds of putting together anything on these issues over the next 6-7 months are so remote as to make it pointless. So to answer Bill's call, or even Ben's, it would have required him changing course on what he believes, or simply, as he did last night, reiterating the fact that he's been here. He's had something to say about Social Security financing and, as he put it, the entitlement problem. By the way, once you use that language, you've shown your card already. Entitlements are something that are nasty and disgusting that we have to do away with. The other way to say is, how are we going to manage our social insurance programs? How are we going to deal with sort of the mandatory spending part of the budget? How are we going to deal with the extraordinary increase in health care costs that are looming on the horizon, that are not associated with just Medicare and Medicaid, but with the healthcare system more broadly. The president has an ideological take on this. He's been clear about it. Whatever he does, he's not going to get anything done this year, and therefore he's simply going to reiterate what he said before. I think that is the overriding reality here. That's why he was bound to produce something that is more personal for him than it is instructive for the country, and that's why the debate inevitably moves to the presidential election and away from what is transpiring at the State of the Union or in Congress the next 6-7 months.
Again, Tom, I got to say, I think that's wrong. I'll just give you an example. On the entitlement issue, he made the entitlement problem far worse. He passed the biggest entitlement in decades.
Exactly. I agree.
Okay, so having him stand up there saying, "I'm trying to solve the entitlement issue," is not only is at best a joke. All right. Now let's talk about health care. He did have some ideas about health care that you mentioned, but his proposal fell short of implementing that idea. It didn't do anything for for the tens of millions of households that don't currently pay income tax. All right, and it relied heavily on an individual insurance market that doesn't currently exist. So it's sort of faith-based health reform. Now, you might still like the market-based reform ideology, but what most people would do in that case is say, okay, we like the ideology, you didn't like some parts of the proposal, we're going to reform it, let's try to get this moved forward. That's a completely doable thing in the healthcare reform proposal. The healthcare proposal that came out in 2007 had the germs of a very interesting and constructive approach to healthcare reform. But instead of compromising or developing it further or figuring out how to do the individual market or extending refundability to low-income households so they could buy insurance too, the administration just stood on its ideology.
Yeah.
So you can choose to do that, but you're not going to get anything done. And that's where the waste comes in. Social Security, the same thing too. There was a 2-week period in the spring of 2005 where all of a sudden it hit a large number of Republican senators that creating individual accounts didn't do anything to solve the Social Security financing issues.
Right.
And as soon as that happened, support evaporated immediately. So the administration had been talking about Social Security since 2002, not making that distinction between the financing issue and personal accounts evident, even to its closest colleagues. All right? That's not leadership. That's just ideology. All right? Social Security actually is not a big issue. You could sit down and solve that in a week if you had people sort of good spirit, of charitable nature, willing to work together to solve it. It's not that big a deal. They stood on ideology to stop it. And so, from my view, yeah, maybe he's burnishing his long-term reputation as the upholder of the ideas, but I just don't quite get what ideas it is. Increases in entitlement, Social Security plans that don't work, health care plans that depend on markets that don't exist, and so on. I mean, that's just not an attractive legacy. And more than that, for all of us, it's a waste of an opportunity of the world's greatest country to solve a lot of its biggest policy issues.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
To defend this is saying, well, he didn't want to change course in midstream and he wanted to, land on a high note, I think is just missing the point entirely. It's the ultimate inside
just to
spin.
show Bill is trying to create some distance between us, but it's tough because I agree entirely with him on the substance of this, and when I'm addressing that mode, I make exactly the arguments he's making. I'm trying to explain George Bush, and I think his reassurance that history will vindicate his actions is what's Panglossian, but the only comforting take is that he believes this will happen after he dies, and therefore he will never actually confront it. But my view is that is what the Bush presidency has been about. Nothing is more important than tax cuts, and anything that looks like a tax increase is off the table. Once you make that, then it limits your ability to deal with all of the other things you talked about. That's why we have elections. That's why we hope we get alternatives posed and issues framed in ways that allow us to do something different.
I have a question.
Very quickly.
But
Very quickly, let me just interject foreign policy here, and Tom will be glad that he gave me the floor because I really want to underscore what he said. I think you saw that sense of confidence about the president has always exuded, that he will be vindicated in history, that his history will vindicate his decision to invade Iraq in particular. In a sense, it was almost a rebound from some of the rhetoric you heard a year ago in his speech announcing the new way forward and the surge of American troops, in which he had sort of scaled back American ambitions in Iraq to something that might be an Iraq that could sustain itself and defend itself and contain itself within its borders. Last night he talked, as he had several years ago, in almost sort of surreal terms about an Iraq that would show millions across the Middle East that a future of liberty is possible, an Iraq that is a friend of America, a partner in fighting terror, and a source of stability in a dangerous part of the world. Now, this is obviously fantastical rhetoric. I think nobody, certainly nobody who follows the region, expects that kind of an outcome, not only in the near future, but really in our lifetimes. Everyone in the region understands that Iraq is a burning dispute that is likely to get worse before it gets better yet again, and ultimately is going to be a significant source of difficulty for American interests in the Middle East for generations to come. And yet the president returned to that rhetoric last night, which suggests that he's either fully checked out from reality or that he really genuinely believes that his decisions originally were correct and that history is going to prove it so.
Now, Bill has a question, apparently.
Now that you've explained George Bush to us, evaluate the substantive policy agenda of the Bush administration here going forward.
I actually have a lecture on this, and the president rates conceivably on a range of matters, given what he inherited, which all presidents inherit something, what new challenges were presented, how he responded to them, how he left. How he is likely to leave the country, the condition of the country internally, its standing around the world, the nature of our democratic institutions and how they're functioning and their legitimacy. I think he's done more harm than any other president has done in office. Yes, sir.
Charles, freelance correspondent. Any of you, could you get some hint from his speech as to how determined he is to get bin Laden dead or alive before he leaves office? And then, how does he proceed it? Thank you.
What was that trade?
That was bin Laden.
Oh, bin Laden. Oh, I'm sorry.
I found it somewhat ironic that the president actually quoted bin Laden. Of course, we all recall that for a number of years, the administration tried to avoid even referencing him by name or speaking with any specificity. But last night, he referenced bin Laden as a source on the success for the surge in Iraq, and the fact that bin Laden's recent video communication was testimony to the success of the surge in Iraq. Obviously, there's an irony there because the persistence of bin Laden, his ability to communicate, well, obviously makes it clear that ultimately in dealing with, the central figure in the 9/11 attacks, in dealing with the organization and the capabilities that have apparently been able to reconstitute themselves in a variety of different scenarios, the administration described no real policy. And you can look to the kind of contrast between the lengthy discussion that the president engaged in on Iraq with a very limited discussion on Afghanistan and a very limited additional commitment of American troops, about 3,500, suggests that the president and the administration doesn't really have any agenda going forward for dealing with the area that has demonstrated its ability to provide a sort of safe haven and proving ground for al-Qaeda and the proliferation of these ideas and these capabilities throughout the region. So surprising that the presidents would reference him, but I think obviously quite disappointing that he recognizes he's going to go out of office with very little progress there as well.
Yes, back here.
Yes, hi. Hi, I wanted to get the panel's feedback on sort of the internal structure of the Bush administration, if it's holding together. Last year, there was a lot of news about it losing people and so forth. I was curious about during this year, is it going to hold together in order to accomplish even limited goals? Or are you going to start to see some dissent? I'm starting to see some things with the EPA involving California. Like, any take on what's going to be happening with the agencies in the White House?
Do you want to take
the answer to that, I'm sure, with this, as with all administrations in their 8th year, is that it will not hold together. You will have a steady trickle of people, which has, already happened, leaving, and that actually does, over time, particularly if you don't have a good relationship with the Senate for their replacement, and the administration has a particularly dreadful relationship with the Senate. Not all of it its fault, over appointments right now, that has gotten bad enough that when the Senate goes out of town now, they leave somebody here to prevent the president from making recess appointments, when that will leave in a lot of agencies, and particularly those in which the highest priority decisions are not being made. A lot of people in acting capacities who will feel disabled from making certain decisions, and a lot of stuff, as with all administrations, will end up getting deferred into the next administration. The component that probably exacerbates that in this administration is that there are a lot of people who have a lot of incentives not to be bitter enders because of the president's low approval ratings and the sort of sense that a lot of agencies have not necessarily shrouded themselves in glory. And so, as job prospects arise, people's loyalties are probably a little bit lower than that's a very broad generalization, but than they might be in an administration that was going out with 70% approval ratings, that was, I'm sure, and that anticipated a win for their party in the next election, which in turn creates internal opportunities within the executive branch.
I think Ben's right, and the hollowing out of government will almost certainly proceed apace. But this, again, tells us some is inevitable, but the president has 4 people that are going to stick around until the end, and those are the 4 people that are working on matters of interest to him. Condoleezza Rice, Gates at Defense, Mukasey at Justice Department, and Josh Bolton is his White House Chief of Staff. As far as the departments and agencies of government, my guess is State, Defense, and Justice are the only ones that end up, other than OMB, basically relevant to what will transpire ahead. And while he doesn't have the deputies and assistants in place in many cases, he's got the top person that he's going to rely on.
I think it's important, though, in the case of Justice, to emphasize that Mukasey is, there was an incredible vacancy crisis at the Justice Department at the time that Mukasey was appointed, and there has been, only limited success in resolving that, and so there's a lot of Mukasey may be the only one, at the Justice Department on January 20th.
Bill?
I was just thinking of that comment in terms of economic policy. What I was going to say was it seems like Treasury under Secretary Paulson has really stepped it up.
Yeah.
And both internally and outside the administration has done a better job of exerting the Treasury Department as the leader of the economic team, which is traditionally where it's supposed to be. And then it just occurred to me that one of the dogs that didn't bark in the State of the Union address last night was corporate tax reform. Treasury's made this a big emphasis. I participated in a session this summer over there where there's a lot of consensus across the board on ways to make the corporate tax system work better, to make business tax systems work better, and it just vanished. I just realized it now. That's kind of a mystery to me.
I'm so glad Bill pointed that out, because that was the department and the secretary that I left out that is a critical part of the team going on. But it is sobering that's a big part of Hank Paulson's interest and agenda, and it was not mentioned. Final question right here.
Thank you, Caroline Vicini. I wanted to ask you, what does this give Congress to work with, this State of the Union of the nation? Because Congress is up for election again, also this fall, and those races are not so much talked about. What possibilities gives this to both to the Democrats and the Republicans to sort of reinsure their seats, and what does it mean to them?
It's no surprise that Speaker Pelosi took the initiative to try to forge a bipartisan package to negotiate with the administration on a stimulus package. She's chastened by the reputation for partisanship that developed during the first year. She didn't have that in mind, but in the end, facing implacable opposition to many things they wanted, they decided to run the institution in a very partisan fashion to produce some legislative harvest. But she is trying to alter that, but she's well aware of the fact that it will be hard to do beyond the stimulus package. When you're writing checks for people, it's easier to find agreement than when, there are substantial costs associated with actions as well as benefits. I think you'll see some low-level efforts and there are many items still hanging from the previous Congress where you could still get some authorizations passed. She'll look to avoid deep conflict in the budget process on Iraq. She will avoid the series of continuing votes linked to funds, realizing that the president is going to have his way unless Petraeus testifies that he needs to reverse the withdrawal of troops and to gear up again. And what I think they will do is increasingly connect their actions with the agenda of their presidential nominee, not in expectation of passing legislation, but in framing choices for the election. Bill?
That's a really good question. Just two comments. One is, I think it was Tip O'Neill's dictum that all politics is local. It's not a coincidence that a Republican holder of the White House is trying to restrict earmarks in an election year with a Democratic Congress. So there might be some. Now I'm falling into Tom's mode. I'm explaining George Bush. The other thing I want to add, though, is if you look around, sort of what can they do that A, doesn't cost much, B, is not only something they can compromise on, but something that's consistent with their party's beliefs, and C, could actually get done. The thing that keeps coming back in my mind is retirement saving. The Pension Act in 2006 pushed automatic 401ks, made them much easier to enact. That's been a huge success. There's been a lot of take-up on that. That's continuing to expand, but it doesn't cover the half of the workforce that's not covered by a 401k. There's a proposal in Congress, bicameral, bipartisan sponsorship, to create automatic IRAs that would essentially deal with the half of the workforce that does not have access to defined contribution options. It would basically create payroll deduction IRAs that would let people sort of automatically save via IRAs. Democrats like it because it helps low-income households. Republicans like it because it's saving. And there is some momentum, and I think when they look around and think, gee, we really need to do something, what can we do? That will jump to the top of the list.
I also think that it's just worth mentioning at the very high altitude level that presidential election years in periods of divided government are not typically productive legislatively, and there's a reason for that, which is that neither side knows who will get the credit for any particular piece of legislation, and it's more important for the other side not to get credit than it is for you to get credit, whoever you happen to be. And so it's except in situations like the economic stimulus environment, in which everybody perceives a need to do something right away, because otherwise, you get a sort of pox on all their houses reaction among voters, in which case you can have action that's very speedy. Those are really the exceptional cases. The much more common thing is that after a certain date, and I think Tom will probably back me up on this, that date keeps getting earlier and earlier. The longer the election season expands. But after a certain date, you just end up starting to defer major legislative decisions until the next administration. And that there are exceptions to that. I mean, the welfare reform package in the first term of the Clinton administration is an example of that. But it's not; these aren't typically sort of productive legislative harvests.
I think on the uncharacteristically upbeat comment from Bill, and then the qualification of the overlying political realities, we have found the point of conclusion and adjournment. Thank you all.
We have hit zero marginal utility. I thought the reason that 08 was not likely to be productive was that no years.